Good afternoon. It's Senate Institutions. It's Wednesday, March 15th, and we're going to spend some time today with Secretary Julie Moore and Director of Engineering for Water Investment Division, Eric Blatt. We're going to talk about Section 10 in our capital bill. Talks about clean water and a bunch of other stuff. So, Secretary Moore, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Let's see if we can make all the technology work. There we go. All right. For the record, I'm Julie Moore, and I'm the Secretary of Natural Resources. And so thought I would start by just a little bit of an overview of the Clean Water Initiative. This is in some ways a bit of an outlier in the way the capital bill is structured, in that the clean water funding actually is spread across several agencies. And the recommendations for how that money is distributed are actually brought to the governor by the Clean Water Board. So just talk a little bit about the history, how we got there, the other components of the funding portfolio for clean water, because the capital bill is but one, the role of the Clean Water Board, and then we'll leave you with the capital bill request, which dovetails into Eric's presentation specifically around the state revolving loan funds. So I always love this set of photos because they're all taken by staff in the course of their jobs. So Vermont does have some pretty spectacular water bodies, and the intent of our Clean Water Initiative is to protect the best and restore the rest. So
I like that.
And this is what we are seeking to address. And the vast majority of the water quality concerns that the Clean Water Initiative is focused on are driven by precipitation, rainfall, and snowmelt. Vermont doesn't have a lot of factories. Our wastewater treatment plants, and Eric can speak to this in more detail, are relatively small by national standards, and more than half of Vermonters are served by septic systems. But we do see a lot of precipitation. So runoff from farm fields, from roads, from parking lots, et cetera, can carry sediment and other pollutants to our water bodies. So the types of water quality concerns we see in Vermont are really driven by nutrients, excess phosphorus and nitrogen. That image on the right is a blue-green algae bloom in Lake Champlain. These concerns aren't unique to Vermont. The EPA does a national lake assessment once every 5 years, so we'll have benefit of the newest one later this summer. But they did find that 20% of the nation's lakes have high levels of phosphorus or nitrogen. And some important examples are Lake Pepin, which is sort of the headwaters for the Mississippi River in Minnesota, and then Lake Erie, and perhaps the most well-known blue-green algae bloom that impacted the city of Toledo's drinking water system several years ago. Vermont is taking some really good and important steps to address nutrient pollution. We have a number of regulatory programs that exceed federal minimum standards that were codified in Act 64 of 2015, which is sometimes referred to as Vermont's Clean Water Act. And then the committed resources we have available to support this work, which is pretty unique to Vermont. We have pollution budgets, which are sometimes referred to as total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs, for a number of water bodies that tell us essentially how much nutrient can reach those water bodies before there's an adverse effect. So there are separate pollution budgets for Lake Champlain, Lake Memphremagog, Lake Carmi, as well as the Connecticut River, which is a major tributary to Long Island Sound. And here's the restore the best and then protect the rest in a few more words, as I said before. Capital funds have been supporting this clean water work since at least 2003, and includes several different types of projects. Agricultural best management practices, so things like manure storage and silage leachate treatment systems, treatment for stormwater runoff, including detention ponds, as well as some green infrastructure practices, improvements at municipal wastewater facilities, and then also natural resources restoration projects, including things like floodplain protection, wetland restoration, and some forestry best management practices. So we are able to take our pool of state funds, which on average right now is somewhere between $50 and $60 million a year, including commitments contained in the capital bill, some ARPA funding, and several other sources I'll get into in a minute. And we combine that with local dollars from municipalities, federal funds to the maximum extent possible, and then commitments and contributions from private landowners where the work is taking place. So the FY24 clean water proposed budget is just north of $62 million. About, or a little less than half of that, comes from the Clean Water Fund base. As you may know from other hats you wear in this building, the property transfer tax has been way outperforming itself for the last several years, and that's part of the reason we're not just at the upper end of our range, but we've exceeded that $50 to $60 million annual target. We also are the beneficiaries of the unclaimed bottle deposits for our clean water work via sheets. Those average about $2 to $3 million a year. And then the Clean Water Fund receives 6 points of the rooms and meals tax. We also sort of each, it's like a skip a year process, look back when the tax department gives us the final numbers for the end of the previous fiscal year. And this year had almost $15 million on the bottom line, where we budget to what tax projects. And frankly, again, the property transfer tax and the sheets well exceeded their projections in FY22. We also have $10 million worth of ARPA funding that the legislature committed in FY22 for $10 million a year for 3 years. And then finally, there's the capital bill component. This year, the clean water funding in the capital bill, the request is for just south of $16 million. That includes some of what I'm not sure how you refer to that in this room, but like the traditional capital bill is that 5.9, and then the one-time GF to cash fund recommendation the governor made is another $10 million. We also, actually I should flip to this. So all of those are places that the Clean Water Board opines on in making a recommendation to the governor. Less about the dollar figures and more, they take in those estimates from the tax department, direction we receive from the Agency of Administration around the capital bill and how they are going to recommend the General Assembly consider allocating those funds. The Clean Water Board takes in all that information and then sets a suite of priorities related to wastewater treatment, stormwater treatment, agricultural best management practices, et cetera. In addition, we have been the beneficiaries of some money that Senator Leahy worked hard to secure. It's currently about $6 million a year. It comes to us through the Lake Champlain Basin Program. It is specific, therefore, to the Lake Champlain Basin. It can't be spent outside that area, but it is additional funding that's available for clean water work. And then I always just want to note that this there is some work that's funded through the T-bill, Senator Moss is probably well aware of, to address stormwater runoff from state highways, but that is outside the purview of the Clean Water Board and not something we track here.
Yes.
Julie, can I just ask you, Senator, excuse me, Renner and I sit on the Agriculture Committee too. Isn't there money, and maybe I'm confusing water quality with clean water, when a large farm or medium farm applies for a permit from the Agency of Agriculture, they pay a fee. And doesn't that fee go toward water quality as well?
It is paying for the staff that support the administration of these programs at the Agriculture Agency.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. So jumping in then to the specifics of the capital bill. And so there are actually 3 separate entities that are receiving portions of that nearly $16 million that's being requested in the FY24 capital bill. The Agriculture Agency, ANR, and in 2 places, actually, DEC, and Eric's going to talk more about lines 116 and 117 in a minute, as well as FPR for some forest access road improvements. And then VHCB, who partners with the Agriculture Agency and helps in instances where the tools in the Ag Agency's toolbox aren't perfect for the need. In addition, The capital bill includes a placeholder for FY25. We sort of have this little bit of a mismatch of directions that are provided to different entities. The Clean Water Board budgets on an annual basis. And so we'll come back in FY25 with a specific set of recommendations or requests for how to allocate the money across the different needs for clean water, but there's a $10 million placeholder in there in anticipation. And so you can see that the recommendation of the Clean Water Board was $2.2 million of capital funds to go into agricultural water quality grants, about $550,000 to go to the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, to reduce erosion associated with our road and trail networks. Just as a point of reference, we have more than 600 miles of forest access roads that we maintain as an agency and innumerable trails. And then $2.8 million to the Housing and Conservation Board, one piece for land conservation work, and then another piece for water quality projects and conservation easements. And I think with that, I would turn it over to Eric, because obviously there's the other piece of this is the SRF components. If we flip back to here, and he can speak to those in some detail unless you have questions about these components.
This green algae that we talked about in St. Albans Bay has a lot. We don't have any in Mounts Bay. I mean, it's different just because the water is more active in the Bay Area. Because I represent like 27 miles shoreline to Dakota. But in other areas, there's a lot of it. I never seen any in our Bay.
Yeah, you don't want to ever say never.
Well,
But there's a lot of it depends. And we know the types of conditions that are more favorable for blue-green algae blooms. And it tends to be shallower, warmer, stiller water.
St. Albans, they had a lot of it. I went up one day, saw it gone forever.
Yeah, and Missisquoi Bay tends to have significant problems. There are often some more localized blooms in Burlington, along the Burlington shoreline in the nearshore environment. There are places like Arnold Bay in Addison County where there are also significant blooms.
Does it grow from right there in the water? That's where it starts, right?
Yeah, and the algae themselves, or cyanobacteria, are actually they can move through the water column, and so they have a competitive advantage. My understanding is they can go down and essentially use nitrogen that's near phosphorus and nitrogen that's near the bottom, which gives them an advantage over other types of algae and bacteria.
Areas you don't see any of it. You wonder where how it formed.
Well, and there's times where you can have. I went to Lake Carmi this summer because they had some particularly challenging water quality conditions that I think were very frustrating given the level of effort that's gone into some of the watershed practices and then the aeration system. And so they called and asked if I would come up to talk with some of the Campers Association. And they had this horrific bloom. And literally I showed that through Tuesday night, and I came on Wednesday, and it
Who's gone?
had just dissipated.
Oh.
No, they were.
Yeah, right.
You gotta live
I know.
there.
Well, I
You gotta
was-
move.
You went up at night.
Right.
Where does it go?
I think it essentially just breaks down, or it can become distributed. I mean, there's still algae present. You can see it in the water column a lot of times, but it's not in these dense mountains on the
landlocked, so-
surface. Yeah, but so it doesn't really disappear, but the sort of noxious conditions that they've been experiencing right along the shore dissipated.
St. Albans Bay, I went with that. You could walk on it. It was so.
Yeah, it can look like meat.
Yeah.
It is. It's.
Are we gaining ground? I mean, are we getting better?
So I think it depends on how you measure it. Emily Bird, who manages our Clean Water Investment Program, which tracks all of this work, and her team put together a very comprehensive report. I'm sure she'd love nothing more than come talk to you about it. But it shows, based on all of the projects and practices we've implemented, we believe we've reduced phosphorus pollution, reaching Lake Champlain, I think between 12 and 15% of what we need to achieve the goals of the TMDL. So we're making progress. one of the things we're learning from some really detailed monitoring work we did in Lake Carmi following the installation of these aeration units is that sometimes even if you shut off what's coming in from the watershed, and it comes out of the bottom sediments in the lake, which is part of the reason we are now talking about an alum treatment in Lake Carmi to sort of keep that phosphorus bound to the bottom sediments. So it's imperfect. I think, you know, ideally you'd want to say, well, we've made 15% of the necessary investment or reduced loads by 15%. We're seeing 15% fewer algal bloom days. We can't make that kind of correlation yet. But I think, you know, all evidence points to we're headed in the right direction.
Well, because I don't know that we're any fewer cows in the state of Vermont, but we're certainly fewer farms. And I'm just thinking about Route 14 going from Hardwick to Irisburg. I think there's one working farm on that, and there used to be 50. And so just in that section alone, I'm thinking of the old manure pits that they non-existing manure pits and all of that. And so that's a significant amount. But all those fields are still being farmed. I get that from bigger farms, off-site farms and stuff. So yeah, so I guess you're still getting the runoff, aren't you?
We are, and stormwater, particularly is changing climate and more frequent and intense precipitation. We're seeing more stormwater runoff. Certainly our wastewater infrastructure is aging, and so keeping after that is really important. And it's this sort of complex stew of trying to do new projects and then also continue to make important investments in maintaining everything we've already built so that we're not losing ground on one side at the same time or gaining ground on another.
Some of the camps, that are right on a lake, do they have some overflow that creates that? I know we're sewers and closest on the lake, but those cottages have been on the lake for 100 years. You know, they had no septic coming, let's be honest, you know.
So we've recently done, and I can't claim to know the results of it, but we recently did a small study around Lake Carmi with our geology division and our drinking water and groundwater division to look at contributions from septic systems to phosphorus loads in lakes. Sort of the conventional wisdom, phosphorus really likes to stick to sediment. And so the thinking is if you have adequate soil, which may or may not be adequate from a bacteria perspective, generally it's always adequate from a phosphorus perspective. I think we're learning that that's not always the case. And that work has taken place. But I don't know the specifics of it. It's certainly something we're looking into, and have an initiative with a number of different lake associations who have been called septic socials, but encouraging camp property owners to, particularly camp property owners from out of state who may be on a sewer system at home and not have ever lived with a septic system. Correct, to understand that there are some maintenance needs for those systems and help get good information to them about how to maintain.
Please, and sorry, I was late. I'm sorry, I missed the beginning. I just have a question about the amount that V-Trans pays for the runoff, because I'm curious about that, because I was in a town on the eastern side of the state and we were looking at a stormwater utility, and that the revenue just from that is really helpful and justifies the stormwater utility. So is that program still going to continue at the same level, and do you all do anything to help folks
With
do stormwater utilities? Because it's a great funding source, and it's very fair and effective.
So we have had historically a 4-year, $25,000 a year incentive for municipalities that create stormwater utilities to sort of help them launch and get up and running.
Great.
And that is funding that comes out of the Clean Water Board. It's administered by the Agency of Administration. I think we're at the point now where we're only paying in one community. Historically, it had been as high as 4 or 5, just based on where they were in their evolution. But if if there's a community that's considering it, I can provide you with some additional.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
If there's a website.
Yeah, I'm not sure how well known it is, but it is a commitment
Okay,
we've
that's
made.
fair. Thank you.
Anybody else? Thanks.
I'll trade seats with you, Eric.
Eric, welcome back. Good to have you here. Newcomer to this building.
Sort of. So I have a PowerPoint presentation and Linda's gonna control it. Just see that there are 11 slides, the first slide and the last slide, which are not information, it's just kind of
You know, it's inside.
so I don't know how much time we actually
You
have.
have as much time as you want.
Okay, I saw 2:15. Okay, so, I wanted to touch on, the basic components of the programs, the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, and then the pollution control grants that are capitalized or requested capitalization for these two lines. And so just stop me if I'm going too deep into this, we could just move on to the
No,
next slide.
that's fine. You just go right ahead. We like having you here.
All right, so line 116, that's the Clean Water SRF match. And line 117 in the spreadsheet in the capital budget request is for the pollution control grants. So we can move to the next slide. So the match that we're asking for is $332,981. And that figure is the balance that we need to fully match. Later on, I will show how that's matching the federal grants that we're going to receive during the cycle. So I'll pick that up on a later slide. And then the 10 million, you saw the number in Secretary Moore's presentation. And that is not debt, that's general fund that go into this capital expenditure cash.
Now, you talked about a $10 million, Secretary, you talked about a $10 million grant and one ARPA fund monies. And then one next year and one after that, or
This is the final year of the.
final
ARPA
year,
money
okay. Okay.
Coming to the Clean Water Board.
Okay, and that's just, the numbers are just coincidental, that's not the $10 million right there, okay, that's from out of the cash fund. Okay,
So we go to the next slide. One of the reasons I include this slide, aside from just explaining how the state revolving fund match, just barely touching on the grazing surface, is the fact that one of the things we can't do is tell you exactly which projects are getting the capital request that we ask for as the match, which is a 20% match to the federal grant. Because as you'll see in this illustration, the 20% match in the upper left-hand corner goes into the fund along with the federal grant. And out of the fund, obviously go the SRF loans, but back into the fund are the loan repayments on those loans. And at this point on the clean water side, we're revolving about 10 million. There's a companion drinking water fund, which is about 6 million a year. We're not going to talk too much about water today. It's in another section of the capital budget as far as the match, but very similar principles apply. Are there any questions on this?
so help me understand the match, are we gonna get to those numbers a little bit
Yes,
as
we're
far
gonna-
as what that amount of money is gonna leverage?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes. Okay. So we can move on to the next slide. So this represents the annual cycle. So we go through the same cycle year after year because we receive these federal dollars on an annual basis. And we've been receiving them since the late 80s on the clean water side. Somewhere around 87, 88, we transitioned from federal construction grants that basically helped build a lot of the treatment plants, converted a lot of them from just primary and secondary treatment. This was back in sort of the heyday of the construction grant program. The decision at some point was to transition to a revolving loan program, straight out grants. So right now on this cycle, we are just ending step 1, which is receipt of priority list applications. So in order to fund projects, these dollars, we have to post projects on an adopted priority list. And the first step is to solicit applications just to get on the list, municipalities and some privates. Predominantly, the funding goes to municipalities, but back in 2018, we sort of opened the door to privates as well, following some changes at the federal level. So at this point, we are in the process of reviewing these priority list applications. PPL is a project priority list. Later on, I'll also talk more about the number of apps that have come in. I'll talk about it in the context of pollution control grants, which are part of the funding, and we place those same projects on the list as well. So we'll do most of these projects that qualify for Clean Water State Revolving Fund loan also qualify for grants. Not all of them receive grants, but it's based on the points that they receive out of our ranking system.
I'm sorry, what's IUP?
Oh, intended use plan. And so,
Intended use.
right, so the intended use plan is about a 50-page document, and there's a link to it at the end of this PowerPoint. So, and it's basically comprises the adopted priority list, which shows all the projects and the type of funding that they qualify for, a forecasted list, which shows a projection of future projects as far as we know. And it also goes into a lot of detail about the financing arrangements with the fund. We have to show the pace at which we're receiving the federal dollars into the fund, some projections in that intended use plan.
So,
Go
just
ahead.
one, sorry, so is that required by the federal government?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So a lot of your, and again, Eric, don't let us get ahead of you. If we're gonna get there, just say, hey, we're gonna get there. So a lot of this is municipalities either diverting water on some way, somehow, settling out water. Is it wastewater treatment facilities, treatments?
Yeah, we can talk about the kinds of projects that we're actually funding now. I will get into it later, but we can do that now. So I mean, predominantly right now, with the loan fund and the pollution control grants, it's going into essentially refurbishment of treatment plants.
Yeah.
Some new plants, not new direct discharging facilities. That's almost impossible in Vermont to receive approval.
Right.
There are about 100, roughly 100 municipal systems that are part of the universe that we fund out of this program. And the one thing we are seeing now, and we're encouraging it, for new systems are community scale soil-based systems.
Yeah.
So we have about a dozen communities right now that are at some stage of project development that are pursuing community scale systems. So in other words,
I think we have one of those at
individuals
Newport Centers. Newport Center, it's been there for some time, but
they have one. Yes,
Yeah.
already.
yeah.
That I'm not aware of them being on our Newport being active on our list right now.
No, it's just been there for a little bit, and I guess the reason why you just taught me something today is, I said, where's your big tanks and where's it all that? But when you look over there, it's exactly. how
They're
you
more
described it.
passive type system
Right.
than the sort of a traditional direct discharge.
Yeah.
Right now, just to name a few of them, Westford is pretty far along with developing a community scale system. And these are, by the way, these are just for the sort of the population centers, the village areas.
Right,
So
right.
not just the broad,
Right.
expansive system for the town.
Yeah.
It's really concentrate the area of growth potential in these communities. And in some cases, they turn a community that currently is seeing a decrease in population a little more vibrant.
They sure hope not. That's in my district. They're really hoping not. Well, you know how this goes. There's people who want to stay
It's a mix.
like the country,
for sure.
right? But they're.
Well, but again, in effect, it does encourage that because it encourages just this concentration in one area and not expanding out. But so Westford, Montgomery has 2 village centers that they're looking at. Essentially, they're like 2 discrete projects for one community. Londonderry has interest in this. They're pursuing planning let's see.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask, but I was Londonderry.
Huntington, Huntington, Waitsfield has actually, as far as I understand it, they've actually acquired the land many, many years ago. In fact, they had gone through the process of establishing the soil capacity for wastewater. They had a subsequent bond vote which did not pass. It's back sort of on the radar. Communities pursuing it. Wardtown is looking at a solution. Let's see. I think, there are a few others out there that come to mind.
What's the,
Jamaica's another.
oh, Jamaica is?
Yeah.
Oh, good, that's been a big controversy.
Grafton, they,
South Dairy, right? South Londonderry.
yeah, well, I mentioned Londonderry, there's sort of two,
Yeah.
Well, I'll stop there.
Well, that's-
There are two
Well,
others.
it's
Very, very interesting. So you've done well.
Yeah. Let me just say.
Well, Senator Moses will upset you haven't said anything about Colchester yet, but you hit all the rest of us, so.
We'll get to Colchester. That's a big project, and you'll see it in the pollution control grant discussion. What I will say about many of these communities, this is not new to them. Some of them it is, but many of them, these projects take a long time to develop. We're hoping to accelerate with the ARPA money because it's a particular category of funding in the current ARPA universe. That will help accelerate it to some degree.
So just to kind of keep you here just for a second longer, so you had said that we probably will never see anything with direct discharge. This is the new way of cleaning water within municipalities as far as in almost like a larger scale private septic system. This is just a community septic system.
Yes. In our, who knows what technology may develop down the road decades from now. But at the current, under the current, regime, it is not likely that new discharge will get. I mean, I wouldn't rule it out 100%, but I think it's
Interesting.
very much enough to allow it to get there. So on this cycle, ultimately, we get to the point where we adopt the intended use plan and the project priority list. We target late spring to early summer to adopt, and then we are applied for the federal grant. So they generally award the grant to the state in August, September timeframe, intentionally before the beginning of the next federal fiscal year. So we try to get the grants out to the states within the first year of its availability. There's a 2-year window in which states can apply. There are a number of reasons why it's advantageous for both the state and EPA to award these grants within that period. So, and then we start the cycle all over.
Yep.
We'll move down to the next slide. This describes the types of uses of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, principally for planning and construction funding for the kinds of projects we're talking about. And this just provides a little more description of the categories. Combined sewer overflows, that's a major category. We've been at this since at least dealing with combined sewer overflow remediation since the early 90s. There are a number of municipalities that have achieved essentially 100%, but there are no CSOs. But we're down to somewhere around a dozen, maybe even less than that, with active combined sewer overflows. There are also systems that aren't technically combined sewer overflows in that they don't have both the stormwater collection system tied directly into the sanitary system, which is the traditional description of a combined CSO. But they do have a lot of infiltration. I think Virgins is an example of that, where they've got some old sewer lines that get a lot of infiltration. So in their case, they get considerable overflows. And you'll see Virgins on the list of projects receiving or qualifying for TC grants in this coming list. The other major area of cost for the communities is in the refurbishment plans. So going back to what I mentioned earlier about a lot of these plants getting built in the 70s or the 80s were major upgrades from just primary, really just moving solids, but not really treating to any degree the wastewater, other than disinfection. Those plants are going through a period now where they're having to do some major refurbishment work. South Burlington's Bartlett Bay plant, they just passed a bond about 33 million. It includes some other work as well, but the lion's share of that is just to refurbish the Bartlett Bay plant. South Burlington has two plants, Airport, Drive, Bartlett Bay. Burlington has a significant multi-year both sewer, storm, and wastewater improvement project. So that Middlebury, they back in the 90s, they relocated their plant. They basically built the plant from scratch, turned their previous plant into essentially a pump station. They're now coming in for major refurbishment. So these are tens of millions of dollars in these facilities.
We've mentioned Burlington, and I don't always want to mention Burlington all the time as far as,
You're gonna get away with stuff.
I mean, they have plans in place to keep, it's a stormwater problem that they have. I mean, we see it on the news. It's 7, 8, 9, 10 times a year where they're closing down beaches and all that stuff. They have a correction active plan in place that would stop that.
Well, they have a long-term control plan. I mean, I'm not knowledgeable about the details of their plan. Others that deal more directly with that know. But we are funding one of the projects you're going to see is Manhattan Drive. That's a project to help remediate some of the stormwater issues. But yes, they still have some active sewer overflows, as well as I mentioned, there are a number of other communities. Rutland City has quite a few. We've been funding recent projects year after year to help mediate. What they're essentially doing in Rutland is separating the storm from sanitary, and then they're providing some level of treatment on the stormwater. Kind of a mixed view on this. Rutland City has pointed out the benefits at times of actually having it combined because they treat most of that stormwater because it's passing through the wastewater treatment plant. The problem is when they get the deluge.
Yeah, you gotta be able to have the capacity to hold.
Most of the time, these lower intensity storms are actually treating the stormwater to a higher degree than they would otherwise. But
I would just add too that there was a significant commitment of ARPA funds to accelerating the implementation of a number of these combined sewer overflow control projects. I think we invested $30 million, which is sort of taking 10 years worth of work and gonna accomplish it in 3 to 4 months.
As far as the phosphorus levels and stuff, and so it used to be just basically they concentrated on the agricultural portion of it, but I imagine now we probably have more as far as residential runoff is probably as big as anything.
No, about 40% of, this is for Lake Champlain, about 40% of the phosphorus pollution to Lake Champlain is attributable to agriculture. About 5% is attributable to wastewater systems. Stormwater is somewhere in the 20 to 30% range, and then sort of the majority of that remaining, roughly 1/3, described as sort of natural, right?
Yeah.
There's some amount of stormwater runoff that occurs, or excuse me, phosphorus that occurs, leaves drop to the ground and end up in streams or stream banks, slump in a road. And so there's some of it, the goal is never zero. And
Right.
that remaining chunk is the part that's part of the not zero.
So, as I mentioned, that we also provide planning funding, which is really significant out of this fund because it helps advance projects. And what essentially do is roll the planning loans into the construction loan when the project's ready to go to construction.
Yes.
Yeah, just a shout out. You guys do a great job because I've been in a position to deal with these processes. And we had a engineer who just sets it all out, and the way that the funding allows for planning makes it possible to actually know that you're going to get the project done without raising rates, because people don't like it when you raise rates. And you do have to raise rates some, you know, just to, because you don't want it to be, do it all at one time. But the way that the funding is stacked and scheduled is just great. So just shout out, and then just a question, are you having trouble, or are the municipalities having trouble finding contractors to do the work?
We're gonna find out. We're bracing for, yeah, it's like everybody is pretty well taxed, we believe.
Yeah.
And everybody, the construction companies, the engineering firms, our staff.
It's gonna cost you more, that's all. They're gonna raise rates.
Or we might need to wait longer, so we might wanna make sure the money's gonna stay around, so that we can build things in 5 years.
Project that was 5 million last year, probably be 6 or 7.
Yeah, there's concern. I think we're getting a little past the supply chain issue, but there's still, we have one project, and I don't know if it's because of supply chain issue or it's just the uniqueness of the equipment that they're ordering, but they're going into an extended shutdown. It's not uncommon for projects to go into a winter shutdown. They're going to go into a shutdown through the summer and then pick it up in the fall because they can't get the equipment before then. So we do have examples of that. And yes, we're concerned about the inflationary impacts on these projects. It would be interesting to see what happens this spring. It certainly happened last year. So other uses of the fund, the third bullet, the 2% for technical assistance, and the 4% is for program administration. So the 2% would go out as probably contracts. We could hire people to do that, but we're more likely to use contracts to hire people to assist smaller municipalities with applying for funding. That's really, that is eventually. We have not yet put out reference RFPs for that. That's still available. Just so you're aware of it, the enabling law is in Title 24, as Chapter 120. That's the area of law that governs the use of the State Revolving Fund, which is also, of course, governed by federal law. And then the last bullet is simply the entities that we work with, the organizations we work with, to actually award the loans. So the Vermont Bond Bank handles all the municipal loans, and the Vermont Economic Development Authority handles the private loans. Single largest private loan out of this fund, the loan to a community care facility in Vernon, and that loan was over $2 million. If you've seen the report, we sent out a report on the use of the clean water SRF, which we have to do every year, legislative requirement. You'll see that in the report. That's one of the loans. So we can, yeah, I think we can move to the next slide. And this just describes some of the basic terms that apply to these loans. So they can go out as far as 30 years. Can't exceed the useful life of the project. So for example, if the useful life is estimated at 20 years, and that's the maximum term. It used to be 20 years until recent changes at the federal level that allowed us to go out to 30 years of this fund. And that is actually, even if the feds were to increase it right now, the way state law reads, we couldn't go beyond the wastewater side.
I like that interest rate.
Yeah. Yeah. We have maintained 0%.
Pretty hard to find out.
Is the
That's another
admin
great thing about
fee, is the
program.
admin fee on top, just that's what's, that's just collected off the top, or is it paid over the life of that?
It's the life of the loan.
Okay.
That helps pay for administration of the fund and the technical reviews that are done in-house. We have the staff of now 8 engineers in the State Revolving Fund program on the clean water side, and 4 or so administrative staff. And then there are others who have secondary roles. This money is also used to pay for the bond bank services and data. So between that and that 4%, those are the funds we use to essentially manage this program. Also get a sense of the scale. We have to have an audit done every year of our financial statements, and clean water side, the fund balance. This is at the close of last fiscal year, about 115 million.
115 or 50?
115.
115.
Decreased since then because we've issued a number of loans that have drawn that down, but that's what the balance was. And we have, I mean, there's good and there's bad. We have built up quite a balance over the last 4 or 5 years. This goes back to 2016 when there was just a dearth of loans going out the door. And so we made the decision that in order to accelerate the use of the fund, we were going to put more emphasis on planning. So we did that. And then as a result, we started to receive a lot more requests for construction funding. So it's kind of been cyclical, sort of like the economy, where we kind of go up and down. We do expect that balance is going to come down substantially in light of some of these really large projects that are now starting to come into the program. Subsidy. There's a substantial amount of subsidies available in this program. As you can see in the 4th bullet, 10% of the grant, and then this year the grant is 3.7 million, which is kind of the nadir of grants that we've received from the feds quite some time. And that's in part due to the fact that of the last 2 years now, the Congress has been awarding earmarks, which have actually had the detrimental effect of reducing the allotments out of the state, out of the national level to the states. So just for a sense of context here, we have been receiving about 7.8 million per year for quite a few years from the feds, and that dropped to 5.7 million last year. Now, this coming year, in the range of 3.7 million. So that's the effect those earmarks had.
Yeah.
Our congressional delegation is aware of this, and it has other impact. It's not just the funds for planning loans and construction loans. It really impacts our drinking water funding because we're allowed to take a much larger percentage of the drinking water grants and use that for a variety of activities that the department manages for public water systems, regulatory compliance, technical assistance. So 10% is what we refer to as unrestricted, 10% subsidy. So 10% of that now $3.7 million grant can essentially go out to as subsidy, and it's in the form of loan forgiveness. That is the way that we apply subsidy. There are other approaches that can be taken. That's how we get them on. It's the most straightforward way. So 10% can go essentially to any system, and so we use that to provide incentive for areas that we want to prioritize. A good portion of that is planning loans. Then the other additional 30%, which gets up to the 40% max, is more limited. It can only go to municipal recipients and for either affordability or for what are referred to as sustainable projects. Moving down to the next.
Next bullet.
Yeah. the last bullet, it's just simply is, I don't quantify this here, but just to give you an idea of the factors that we use to establish the amount of subsidy that a community is going to get based on affordability. This is all worked into our priority point system. So now we can move to the next slide. Okay, so this slide shows the relationship between the state match that we are requesting and the federal grants. So over on the left-hand side, column 1, those are the federal grants. And in parentheses is the block of time that each one of these grants is available to the state. So I'm only showing those grants that would be available during our 2-year biennium. So this next grant that we would be receiving is the federal fiscal year 23 grant. And it was technically available October of 22, beginning of the federal fiscal year, and it's available through 9/30/24. So at the time that we requested the match, this grant, for the previous grant, we thought it was going to be in the 7.78 million range. We generally don't know the exact grant amount at the time that we're putting our budget together in the fall. And we did not realize that those earmarks that I mentioned would have such a dramatic effect on the federal grant. So going back a year and a half, fall of 21, we had asked essentially for more than what we really needed.
Right.
So we have a balance available for this next grant. So a combination of this grant being even smaller than the previous one, and the balance we had left over, we only need the figure in column 5.
Yeah.
Column 3 just shows what the match requirement is. Column 4 shows how much was left over from last year. And then column 5 shows the balance.
Still a pretty significant amount of money to be leveraging of those funds.
The next grant will be available during this biennium, but as Secretary Moore mentioned, we request our funding, and it runs through the Clean Water Board, so it would be premature for us to be requesting this match now. But we will need it during this 2-year cycle. So when the adjustment comes up, it will probably show up there. Now, right now, we're estimating 7.78 million. It may be lower than that, don't know. So the past practice with our federal grants, we assume what we think of as level funding unless we hear otherwise. And it's possible that these earmarks will cease after this year. That's possible, we don't know. Questions on that, or?
So you don't put anything in the next year,
Not anymore.
you just wait
We used to
and
do
see
that.
what.
We did this before the Clean Water Board was sort of part of this overall process of looking at clean water funding. So because they do this on an annual basis, not a biennial basis, we have to sort of wait and see. There's the placeholder that Secretary Moore mentioned, 10 billion for FY25, and presumably the match would be part of that.
The board has generally always prioritized meeting our clean water SRF match as the first thing. We sort of take it off the top because of the amount of leverage we're able to gain.
So you can see in column 3 what it in theory would be if we were back to the level that we were previously were receiving before federal fiscal year 22. Federal fiscal year 22 was the year that we saw the first drop, because that was the first time since going back to 2011 where there were earmarks. Those earmarks, as it turns out, in many cases actually are co-funding projects that we're funding out of Clean Water SRF. So there's pluses and minuses here, but all right, so we can move to the next slide. So again, this is just to give you sort of a broader idea of the fund itself, because it's more than just in this case, the 3.7 million in federal grant that would be coming in, plus the state match towards this grant. It also includes this newer round of funding that we're getting through the IIJA. So the IIJA is essentially a 5-year program. The monies have already been appropriated. There's still a little uncertainty each year as to exactly how much the state will receive from those funds. We have a very good idea, but it could be off by a little bit until we actually receive what's referred to as the federal allotment. It's a document that we receive around this time every year, late winter, early spring, where it establishes the precise amount that each state gets out of the national allotment. So these numbers will change a little bit. In fact, when I was at the House with the same screen, the middle bullet balloon was, I think, 11.1 million. So it's changed a little bit. And that's actually comprised of 2 grants, because we have now received the federal allotment document. We actually haven't received it yet for the base grant, but we have received it for the IIJA grants. That's the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act.
Thank you.
Yes, sorry. Also known as BIL, which is the bipartisan infrastructure law. So that's actually the 11.3 million consists of 2 grants. There's what we call the general supplemental grant, which basically goes to the same kinds of projects, similar terms for the base funding, although it bumps up the amount of subsidy to 49%. So remember the screen earlier showed 40% max subsidy with the supplemental funding for the same kinds of projects. It's 49%. The other component or other grant that makes up that 11.3 million is emerging contaminants grant. It's a little over $1 million. There's no match requirement to that grant. So over on the right-hand side, 1.8 million, that's the 700,000+ match to the base grant plus the match to the general supplemental. And this is the second year of this 5-year program from the IIJA funding. In the first 2 years, the match to those funds is 10%. And after that, it jumps up to 20%. So the remaining 3 years, 20%. It also increases until the very last year, the amount of federal grant. The match for the IIJA is actually in Section 9. And Section 9, it doesn't separate out clean water and drinking water, it's just combined into a single value.
Section 9 of our budget.
Yes.
Oh, I see, state 20% match, yes, thank you. For one of those.
It would be a 10,
Maybe
it's 10%, and it's
It might be line 100, yes.
101.
101.
Yeah.
Oh, it's 101. Okay.
101.
One of those two, those are both y'alls. Yeah, it's all right, we don't need to.
Right, it's row 100. So I'm just providing this information so you understand that there's more going into this fund than just this base grant and the state match. That includes the others. Plus, you'll see some notes in the lower left-hand corner. The 10 million that I mentioned earlier in repayments, that's coming into the fund. And then there will likely be some carry forward from previous projects.
Do you ever have towns not pay back?
We have, knock on wood, we
Yeah.
have yet not had a default. We've had a few instances where there have been some delays. We have one very small, this is on the drinking water side, one very small fire district that is struggling. And we're trying to figure out the remedy. We've been really fortunate in Vermont, this hasn't yet happened. So we move to the next slide. So this is the slide that talks about the pollution control grants. So we've kind of shifting gears from loans to grants. So Vermont has been in the business of providing pollution control grants, going all the way back to structured grant, providing a certain percentage to match up with the feds. And I think at one point it was 35% state, 55% federal grant, and then the remaining 10% was local. So the current range is 10% to 35%. And the amount of grant is a function of the priority points that projects receive. So we have a scale of 1 to 100. And there are a number of criteria based on project necessity and project affordability that we use to determine the amount of grant for the project's going to qualify for. Some of the projects don't qualify for grants at all. Some of them qualify for what would otherwise be less than 10%. The decision was that if it's less than that figure, it is not really worth all the effort. So we truncate it. So they have to get enough points in the right categories to at least qualify for 10% to receive any pollution control grant. These grants are sort of companion funding to the loans that communities receive. And they really help significantly cut down on the user rates that they would otherwise experience due to the increase in debt.
So what proportion get funded roughly? Half, 3/4?
Well, the max is 35%.
I mean, of the applications that you receive.
So, off the top of my head, maybe a third or so,
Okay.
maybe a little more. It varies from year to year. This year, we received 108 applications. I can't tell you yet just what those numbers look like. I did take a subset of those, and you're going to see it on a subsequent slide. We did a little bit of vetting of those, but we're just barely grazing the surface of vetting all these applications. I think a year or 2 years ago, we looked at the overall average, and it was around 15% of the gross amount requested on the list, total cost, that roughly 15% was grant eligible, something like that. So it averaged out to that. As I mentioned before, we're just beyond the point where priority list apps have to be submitted to be considered for this next cycle. So we have staff right now that are poring over the applications, which is a lot. A lot of projects to go through. The previous year's priority list, this happens year after year, projects that aren't quite ready to go, they're on a given year's priority list, and they typically resubmit because they have to submit every year. So we can switch to the next slide.
Yeah, we're gonna move it along. We have some folks waiting online.
Okay. So this is just kind of a snapshot of the pollution control projects that qualify for grants and that have already passed their bonds. It's a draft, and it was sort of a quick exercise to try to extract from the apps that have come in who we think is really going to be ready to go this year based on bond status. So you can see that this, again, we haven't really vetted all this. Some of these we are very familiar with, some are kind of new. Bottom line, it's about $110 million in estimated cost. This particular, I think we've got 16 projects listed here out of the 108. So this group alone is estimated 110 million, of which 14.3 million is grant. There's a lot more grant beyond this that's being requested. And this is just FY24. So as far as the $10 million request, And that's essentially, this is a 2-year request. There wouldn't be enough to even meet this list, let alone what we anticipate for the next year. And that's it.
Well, thank you for that. Committee, any questions?
No, it did a long way, thank you.
Yeah. We're spending a lot of money, but in a lot of different areas, so it's kind of nice.
Well, it's really important, so.
Yeah. Oh, no question. We want to thank you guys for coming in. Appreciate you very much, very, very much. I will caution you on that. 10 million of that is in the governor's cash fund. They haven't rated that fund from us yet. We have $62 million sitting in there, so I think it's pretty important that we fight for that money. Although all the 62 million, but especially on that water stuff. So just to let you know that that we'll be fighting for that if people come knocking on our doors.
Much
So,
appreciated.
yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, please do, yes.
Cassandra is online and ready to go.
Okay, does everybody want a 2-minute break or a 3-minute, or you want to power through? What do you want?
Couple minutes would be good.
Okay, couple minute break, yeah.
Okay.
I don't